Express is one of my favorite frameworks for Node.js. It's just a very simple and efficient way to create web applications. So if you need an API, you definitely want to go and have a look at Express in details. In this tutorial, we're just going to go around the main functionalities and how to use it to bootstrap your API. So let's get started. So we're starting with an empty folder. So we're going to create a Node project and install Express. Then we're going to create a new file, index.js, which is going to require Express. And this is how you create the app. So const app equal, and you call the function. And from here you got multiple options. If you want to start, say, a get endpoint, we're going get slash and then our endpoint response. There are a lot of options here. We are just going to talk about them later. But for now, let's just go and, try if this thing is working. It works. And if we start this, nothing happens. The reason nothing happens is because we have to actually start listening to our server. So we're going to go port 300. And the second one is the callback whenever the server is actually ready to receive requests. So we're just going to console.info server is ready. And now if we run the same command, we actually can send requests to this server. So let's try out. Let's send a get request and see what happens. And it works. So let's try to change that and say it still works. And if we go here and send a request, nothing has changed. And that is because whenever you change something, you have to restart your server. Right, so now it works. Well, it still works. So this is a little bit complicated because every time you change something, it just gets annoying, right? You have to change something here, alt tab, start killing the server and restart it. And that's where Nodemon comes into play. So I'm going to install it here, Nodemon. And now if I actually start using this Nodemon and I'm calling index, whenever I change something, it will actually automatically restart the server. So every time I save this file, it restarts my server. So I don't have to do anything here. Let's create another endpoint, which will this time be a post. And sure enough, request response, and it's going to send back some JSON this time. So OK1. So now if I send a get request, I still get it still works, and if I send a post request, I get back some JSON OK. So why do we have this request here if we always use response all the time? Well, let's find out. The first one is that you can actually have a look at the headers that you're receiving. So if we go here and we start sending some headers, for instance, one of the very common one is the authorization one. And we're going to type something. And look at this. What do we have here? We actually see this authorization header, which is available to us, so we can access the headers. Another thing we would be able to do here would be to access the query strings. So if I go here and I start typing something like filter equal abc123, and here I'm going to console.log request.query and actually start sending this. If I go into my terminal now, I can see that I have filter abc123. Another reason we would like to use request is if we have parameters in the URL. So let's say we want to add something like the ID to that URL. So we're going to go column ID, and that endpoint doesn't exist anymore. So if I try this, I'm just getting an error because this endpoint slash doesn't exist anymore. Now I have to pass it something like 123, which would be my ID. And the way to access that is to, let's say we're trying to send it back, is to use request dot, and this time instead of using query, we're going to use param. And be careful because param is actually deprecated, so you need to use params dot ID, and that is matching this thing here. In Express, there is the concept of middleware. So middlewares are essentially running before your handler. So you know this bit here, if I go here and I do request response dot next, and that makes the difference. Basically using next is what makes it a middleware. So if I go here, you have to make sure you call next. If you don't call next, what is happening is it's just hanging, it's just waiting. So you have to make sure that you actually call next every time you have a middleware. And that thing here really is just used to check things. So for instance, let's say I want to make sure that before I even get to the handler, I want to make sure that I have headers, which would be authorization. And that is equal to so if we don't have the authorization header, I actually want to send back an error. So I'm going to use send status, which is going to be 401, and then I'm going to return. Otherwise, we'll just move forward. So let's see what happens. So I go back here and I'm going to send this. I have the authorization header, so it's working. And I'm going to remove it, and now I just get unauthorized. And if I go on the post endpoint, now it's still sending it regardless of the header. What makes middleware very powerful is that you can apply them globally. So if I go here and I take this whole thing and I'm going to use app.use, and I'm not going to pass it any kind of string, I'm going to pass it the middleware straight from the beginning. That means that anything that is going to be called is basically going to go on this endpoint. So use is just whatever it is, just run it. So if I go here now and I just do this post and I try without the header, now I get an error. And if I wanted to, let's say, have something running on, let's say another endpoint, for instance, we're going to go with test, and another one which is going to be test slash hello, and they're both going to do the same thing, which is essentially test slash hello, yes, fine, and they're essentially going to both do the same thing, which is going to be return some kind of response, send, let's say, hello. And now I'm going to use this on /test, and let's see what happens here. So I go back to my get and my ID, and it's actually letting me go through. So now if I go to test, I get unauthorized, and if I go on test/hello, I also get unauthorized. So as you can see, this is basically working on all sub-levels. In our next video, we will start looking at how our API can start receiving data.